Good morning, Elisa. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Chris. Thank you.
And how does that look?
Great. And as people are coming on, what I'll do is I'll introduce our panel, and as they come on, we'll hopefully be ready to go once I finish introducing them all. And I think most of them are already on the call, so that's great. So joining us today is Daniella Jade-Lowe. She was diagnosed with spina bifida and hydrocephalus at birth and has been a lifelong wheelchair user. Daniella Jade is a university graduate with a BA degree focused in history and politics from the University of Bradford, England. Daniella Jade is an emerging journalist and disability advocate. She has written several articles for the Royal Gazette and is currently residing in England. She maintains a blog on disability and accessibility topics. We have Chris Bulley. He has a varied career across the globe with a focus on architecture. He has been involved in small, large-scale, and full campus-sized projects in Bermuda, New Zealand, Europe, the UK, Jordan, and Costa Rica. In Bermuda, he has spent time as the acting director of planning, building control officer, and is currently working on special projects within the government. We have Vince Godber. He is a vision rehabilitation specialist who Phyllis mentioned earlier. He originates from the UK and has worked with people who are blind or partially sighted for 25 years at the Royal National College for the Blind and the Royal National Foundation for the Blind in New Zealand. Before coming to Bermuda, he worked for 6 years for Britain's largest military charity, Blind Veterans UK. He now works for Vision Bermuda, formerly Bermuda Society for the Blind. Lastly, we have Keith Simmons. Keith is well known throughout Bermuda as an advocate for the needs of people with disabilities. Working from his role within the government as the Ministry of Health Accessibility Officer, he has assisted in many projects, big and small. Most recently, he is involved in the improving the accessibility at St. Peter's to the graveyard for the slave and free Black people. You might have seen that in the Royal Gazette just this past week. So thank you to all of our panelists. I'm hoping we can start with a poll question to our audience, and we'll pull that up in a moment. So what we're asking you guys is, what do you think is the most pressing accessibility issue facing Burmedians today? So I think that, yeah, there we go. So we have transportation, building access, accessible policies and customer service, road and park access, including sidewalks, digital interaction, telehealth, online shopping, or other. So people are welcome to answer what they feel is the most pressing accessibility issue facing Burmedians today. We'll give you a moment to do that.
Good morning, everyone. I believe transportation is one of our biggest right now, but I would agree with O.B. Lou that you've pulled off, Alyssa. But,
all right, so we're just getting our individuals on the call to answer to see what their thoughts are, and then we'll close that poll and we'll start asking our panelists our important questions. A poll there. We'll give that another 10 seconds or so for people to answer. Hello, Keith. There you are.
Hi.
All right, we can go ahead and end that poll. Okay, and we can share the results with everybody. So it looks like transportation is what our audience considers as a huge and most pressing accessibility issue, but kind of everything on our list is definitely something that people believe is a pressing issue. So that's great to hear. Thank you for anyone who participated in that poll. So panelists, welcome and thank you for coming on. I'm gonna start, and what we'll try to do, just so our audience knows, I'm going to ask questions questions of all of our panelists and sort of direct it to each individual so that our interpreter doesn't have as much crosstalk to deal with. So our first question, I'm going to ask this to Keith first. What do you see as major issues with accessibility in Bermuda? And you kind of already jumped in on that one.
Really, I think it's changing mindsets, and Chris probably can tell you, just this week I have a planning application that I'm assisting the forward planning team with, and architects know better, and they just, well, developers just don't want to make their premises accessible.
Keith, I'm going to get you to speak up a little bit. Uh-oh, we've lost him. All right, I'm going to move on to Chris for that question. So what do you see as major issues
I think it's
with
just
accessibility?
about.
Shall I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Okay, well, I agree with Keith, and I think that some of the issues that we've got, and I've got a couple of notes, I'm just going to sort of try and refer to them, but I think that a general awareness is really a big concern. I think, and the problem is that people have different perceptions in terms of what accessibility actually means. So I think that in terms of just solving that, really just having a, understanding what physically challenged actually face in their daily lives is something that people don't always really relate to. They don't really have that level of experience to actually know. So I think we have to sort of have a better awareness of that in the first place. And I think then we also have to have a better ability to actually facilitate the creation of accessible spaces. So the work that Keith is doing is really important because, he's a very important link between what people are actually submitting in terms of their building proposals and how they're actually implemented at the end of the day. So these things are really vital for us to get right. And I think that if we can resolve, get a better understanding, what are the legislation, the policies and the procedures that are in place to support this all happening and how you're supposed to deal with that. I think that'll be our first step. And I think the second step is that there's a lot of agencies involved. And sometimes it's very hard for people to actually find this information and actually know where to get it in one comprehensive, cohesive place. And I think that's where people like Daniella really step in because, she's an advocate for this. She's a journalist. She's also a consultant. People like that are able to work with individuals and help them through understanding what the process could be. The Department of Planning would also be, a first stop in terms of helping people to find out, what they need to do and how they can do it. And, the legislation and the policies are there to support that happening. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, both the planning statement and the building codes all support accessibility and the development of accessibility and the creation of accessibility in our built environment. So
we'll get more into that a little bit later, I think, Chris.
Sure.
I know both you and Keith have a wealth of knowledge in that area. What I'm going to ask, and I'm going to direct this to Daniella Jade, what do you feel the major barriers that the average layperson might not realize?
Hello. Yes, I agree. I believe that the major barriers that the average layperson may not recognize is most wheelchair users and probably visually impaired have to research and schedule appointments, leisure activities, and visits. It's time management, time consuming. Traveling may cost more, and it will require extra specialist equipment for some people.
Yes, I'm hearing a lot of extra time that the average person wouldn't have to consider to go do the simplest things sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to throw that question over to Vince as well. So what major barriers do you think the average person might not realize there are?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I think it depends on how you how you define accessibility. I think of accessibility as actually inclusion for people. And inclusion's a complex thing because it takes into account a lot of things, not just the physical environment, but also transportation. It takes into account the training and understanding of people in the kind of outside world. And for somebody to be included in society, all those things have to come together. And so the major barrier for me, for people don't understand, is it's a complex environment and a complex kind of solution. And at the moment, there isn't a joined up solution.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that, you know, even if you have one aspect of, say, accessibility, like the physical accessibility is figured out, there's so many other aspects that might not be there that still makes it difficult for a person with a variety of disabilities. Keith, is your audio working now?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that question? So barriers that the average person may not realize?
What I tend to look at is from birth to death to planning for persons that might have a disability from birth or becoming disabled along the way as they age or by accident or whatever have you. And I look at they must have the proper living facilities first, home life, and then transport to get to education, so that then they may be able to be gainfully employed. And all of these things have to be worked out. It's a process, like what Daniella said, it takes time. And Vince is saying, that a little bit of disconnect in certain places.
Mm-hmm.
The average person doesn't really realize what has to go into making this all happen. But there's some of the things that we have to work on. And at one time we had a committee, I don't know if they still exists from child development stage all the way through for forward planning for persons with disability, especially in the school system. I think that's something that needs to continue on, and it needs to be promoted. And like I said, it's more awareness campaigns that need to take place for people to understand what it takes in just a normal day.
So we had already almost addressed this, Chris. You were kind of jumping into this section. Is there legislation when it comes to physical accessibility and in other directions? How is it enforced? And are there improvements that you see that are actually happening?
Well, yes, there is legislation that is in place, and I think if I can just go through some of that legislation that is there. It's divided in terms of both legislation and then codes and standards. So from my perspective, I think that it really starts with the planning statement. And one of the objectives of the planning statement is to ensure that all new buildings and alterations to existing buildings to which the public have access are accessible to persons with physical disabilities. So that is enshrined in the planning statement. It's actually there, and it gives us the basis on which to then evolve and develop projects. So when a project is actually proposed initially, it needs to meet that kind of requirement, and that is a stated objective. When the project actually becomes a physical project and you go to actually develop the drawings and the project in a more substantial way, the International Building Code and the Bermuda Building Code both have accessibility requirements in there. They're both referred to each other. The International Building Code is also sometimes referred to as the Commercial Building Code, because the building code is kind of divided between large-scale buildings, commercial-grade buildings, and residential buildings. So there are two different codes, but they're very much interrelated. And the residential building code is really just a derivative of the International Building Code. So both of those codes are there. The building codes enshrine in that the ADA legislation. So there is ADA requirements in there, and the ADA standards that are part of the ADA legislation are referred to.
Can you just say what ADA stands for, just in case?
The American Disabilities Association, or Disabled Association. And that legislation came into effect in about 1991. And it was interesting listening to the previous speaker who was sort of talking about the history of how things happened. And that was a code that was adopted by Bermuda into our building code and our building act. So the American with Disability Act has a standard that is associated with it that gives you or prescribes a number of solutions for developing spaces that would tell designers, people with any kind of interest in this, how you can actually create a space that would actually be accessible and would make it easy for people with disabilities to actually use. And part of that is, how easy is it to use, how intuitive is it to use. All those kinds of elements come into that standard. Now, having said that, there are always other ways to resolve things, and it's always a matter of presenting what you need to do. Sometimes the space that you're working with doesn't lead itself to actually be adopted or adapted very well to meet all of those requirements. And I think in those cases, it's always a matter of working with people like Keith to try and find the best possible solution so that it meets as best as possible within the context of an existing building, for example, the requirements of that legislation. So yes, I think that there's definitely legislation in place. And in terms of improving that and adapting that, there are further iterations of that. So, over the years, they're updated according to certain things that happen, and they're also responding to various different social circumstances, as well as adding things in for other physical disabilities, and especially as far as technology developments go. So there are lots of opportunities in there to adopt the further iterations of those standards. And it's interesting that the building control section is actually entering into a phase of updating the building codes at this period of time. And those codes are some of the things that will be looked at in terms of adopting more recent versions of the ADA standards, for example, as well as other standards.
Great. So for most, if someone was to put into planning a request to make changes to their commercial building or their public space, my understanding, and Keith, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that all of those would often end up on your desk to review from an accessibility standpoint. Is that correct?
Not all, but most of them do. We tend to work really closely with planning or environmental health, and also fire department. And we try to work with the agent as much as possible, especially if it's already an existing building, to try to make it as accessible as possible as we can.
Yes, I think really the trick is the existing buildings are always much more problematic than new builds. A new build is very easy. You can design a space according to the requirements. But where you're dealing with existing constraints, it makes it a little bit more difficult.
And now, if someone was, so I know normally you put that that your red sign up if you're making any changes, especially to a commercial space. If someone had a question or a query about what that's going to look like and from an accessibility standpoint, where would they go? Either Keith or Chris.
Yeah, they can contact us at Aging and Disability Services or any of the officers at the Department of Planning are quite helpful in that area. But like Vince, from some of the stuff he was saying earlier, and from a visually and blind standpoint, there's a lot of other things that have to be considered in that scope. And I think Vince can tell you a little bit more about the planning side of access for persons that are visually impaired or blind.
Beautiful, Keith. You've already moved into my next question, in which I was going to ask Vince kind of first up on the next one. So as we move on, when it comes to businesses, so the actual physical businesses, do you think businesses need to address, what do you think businesses need to address in order to serve customers with disabilities in a more equitable way? So how can they serve individuals with disabilities in a more equitable way?
There was a piece of legislation that came about in 2010 in the UK called the Equality Act. And basically what that did was lump together a whole raft of legislation into one act that supported people with disabilities. And the premise of the Equality Act says that every business that provides a kind of service, any kind of service to the public, should anticipate what people need and make reasonable adjustments. So a reasonable adjustment is making the information that you provide accessible to people. So that can be in a variety of formats. It can be, it can be in large print, it can be audio, but anticipating what people might need. And an example of that is I supported a young guy who just left school in Bermuda and wanted to find out what his options were for going into the world of work. So we visited the relative department, and it took us 5 visits to actually get this person's needs met for things like, being expected to fill in forms that he couldn't see. And had he not been supported by somebody else, he couldn't have gone there independently and kind of done that. And those 5 visits, the guy's traveling from one end of the island to the other to find out that he's wasted his time and he can't do anything. And the attitude that came across at the time was, well, it's not our problem. But actually it is. And that's what businesses can do, is to actually kind of invest in training in people, invest in understanding, so that when they're presented with this problem, they're not giving out this kind of impression of, oh, well, it's not our problem and you'll just have to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I really kind of resonate with that, and the kind of the idea that some businesses may have that, oh, we don't seem to have any customers with X, Y, and Z. There might be a reason for that, right? If you don't serve those customers and they know that they're not going to get the service that they need in order to access, they're not going to come. So you're missing out on a whole section. I'm going to pass this question over to Daniella, Jade as well. So so the same question, what do you think businesses need to address, if you have any thoughts, to serve customers in a more equitable way? Daniella, Jade.
I feel that they need to assess wheelchair accessibility and the level of wheelchair accessibility, especially in relation to, for wheelchair users, the visually impaired and the hearing impaired. It affects those three communities to some degree. I think wheelchair accessibility needs to be addressed. Also, time and alternative escape routes or fire escape routes, wheelchair accessibility, fire escape routes, alternative routes if the usual wheelchair accessible route is blocked or needs construction. Things like dropped curbs. I know that sometimes dropped curbs can be an issue. I know that.
Oh, we lost Daniella's video. Hopefully she'll be back in a second. And I definitely agree with what she's saying. And one of the other things that can be interesting, not from a physical disability standpoint, but from a sensory standpoint as well, when it comes to the smells that might be in a business, sometimes that can be very overwhelming for individuals. As well as lighting can affect different disabilities in a different way as well. Keith, do you have any last thoughts on that area?
Unfortunately, Daniella dropped out, but in January, we will be starting sensitivity training. We have a team from the Bermuda Tourism Authority Accessibility Working Group, and Marine Ports will be the first attendees in January. We've been working on this for about a year, and we're going to get Vince involved in that also. And I don't know if anyone has seen the newspaper of HSBC, what they're going to be doing today with their staff. And this evening, they're actually going to lit up the front of their building purple. So it's going to be quite interesting, and we're going to be doing out to persons, different individuals and organizations and employers. We have a lot of, I think it's about 30 organizations or persons have signed up so far. So it's about a 2-hour training, and I think it will be really good and really open up the eyes to all of Bermuda, because we want to give the best experience to residents and visitors alike when moving around Bermuda, as far as participating in events, or not just the accessible part. Like Vince said, accessibility covers a large area, not just the building environment, getting into a building. So it's having access to goods and services and to participate like everybody else.
Now, Keith, that sensitivity training, if anybody has questions about that, or would like to get their business in on that list, maybe people can email us and we can pass those on to you.
Yeah, they can do that, or they can contact Mr. Vito Roberts at the Bermuda Tourism Authority.
Okay, so the BTA.
Or to myself, it's not a problem.
Okay, one of those two. If you're interested in that training, because it sounds excellent, you can contact the BTA, or if you contact Windreach at Windreach, we will get you in the right direction. So moving on to my next question, and this was kind of a big one from our poll. When it comes to accessibility in public transport, and Keith, I'm going to come to you for this question first. How are we doing and how can we improve? I know there's lots of thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it's a lot of improvement. They've had, from my knowledge, 2 committees I've sat on, but there have been about 3 or 4 committees looking at paratransit systems or accessible transportation in Bermuda, and they've brought online some minibuses, but just my personal opinion, it really wasn't thought out properly, because you have a minibus that's a 20-seater with a wheelchair spot, and if I was at home to call a minibus, I need to go to Hamilton. It is not the best way to put it, financially viable to pay a driver to use a bus that size to pick up one person for a fare to take to Hamilton. They really need to sit down with the real stakeholders that are out in the field every day to work out a paratransit system for Bermuda. And we had done that some time ago, and I don't know, it dropped off to the side. I think it was a change of government, something like that, but it's a real need for transport out there. It's difficult.
Definitely. I do know I have seen them, some of our pink and blue buses that do have some wheelchair accessibility spots. As from what I'm aware, they're not really used to their capacity. Would you agree with that?
Those buses were actually brought in to work with the cruise ships to really run from Dockyard to Horseshoe Bay or the beaches for that. But our infrastructure, if you go along the road system, cannot accommodate the buses, and it would take millions to make that work because our laybys are too small. As you know, a lot of our bus stops are just right on the side of the road, where persons are standing up by a pole, no sidewalk. So to try to offload or load someone with a wheelchair, or even if a cane or walker, it will be quite difficult or dangerous.
Now, I wanted to get, Vince, your perspective on accessible transport, kind of from that vision perspective.
Yeah, I'd certainly concur with what Keith says about infrastructure. The infrastructure that Bermuda has, simply by the nature of the geography of the island and the road layout, makes even the public transport system for a lot of vision impaired people inaccessible. As Keith pointed out, you have bus stops with no safe place to stand. And so getting to the bus stop itself is taking your life into your hands quite often, and is enough to discourage people from traveling or even trying to travel. And that makes people then reliant on friends and family, and that constrains the whole kind of relationship when people are working. And you shouldn't be reliant on somebody else to participate in your kind of daily life. Certainly in Hamilton, the bus station, again, part of the current infrastructure. Nobody's suggesting that we kind of bulldoze the bus station and start again. But there are changes that could be made that would make it more accessible for people straight away. And it's that kind of joined up kind of thinking that that we need, and we need, you know, we need commitment and participation from the whole of society, not just one or two kind of experts or specialists, but the people that are actually kind of using it. One of the things I found the most difficult coming to Bermuda is that it's very difficult for individual organisations to take action themselves because of the licensing system in the UK. If Vision Bermuda wanted to provide transport, you know, we could get volunteer drivers and go out and hire a minibus and do it ourselves if there was a need. But the licensing system in Bermuda doesn't allow you to do that. You have to be a qualified public transport driver to actually drive a minibus. So that can, you know, things like that, simple tweaks can make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I have heard some people kind of dealing with when it comes to transport, and I wonder if, Keith, you've heard of this happening to individuals, and it's never happened to me, so I'm just reporting about what other people have said to me, is that often they find that transport systems, minibuses or taxis will often charge them more if they have a mobility issue. Just wondering if you had a comment on that, if there is any laws in place when it comes to that, that sort of thing.
One of the main problems is that there are one or two taxis, well, one I know of, that will charge on the meter fare. But if you call a vehicle, basically you're pre-booking, and usually for someone with a disability means that you have to pay by the hour, which is quite expensive, about $50 an hour. And what happens is that, what would I say? There's probably only about 4 or 5 vehicles that will do the work. So, and also what happens is, if they was to pick me up just to say, go to a hospital appointment, they'll take me to the hospital, and basically they wait around, they wait there. Because if they leave and take another fare, but I'm ready, finished, say maybe in 2 hours, they might not be there. They might be at the other end of the island, and I've got to wait around all day until they get back. So they say what happens is it shuts the window of work down. Mm. So, you know, basically you're booking their time out for those hours that you're out with them. So that's why it's been expensive.
Yeah. So not necessarily an overcharge per se, but the way that someone with a mobility issue needs to access a taxi service changes the fee structure, and it kind of creates a higher fee just because of the way that they do have to access it. Yeah. Good to know.
Can I just say, Lisa, that actually the unsung heroes of the transport system of Bermuda are the drivers and the ferry staff. You know, I hear daily of just incredible kind of commitment, and, you know, bus drivers stopping the bus with a busload of people at rush hour just to guide somebody across the road or to help somebody onto a ferry. They do a fantastic job.
Mm-hmm. I know. So those individual people are, usually you have those kind of stories, but we definitely need to, as kind of mentioned, the structure and how things are organized can probably create a better change than, each individual doing can within their role.
Yeah, if I may just jump in on the ferry staff, actually, and there are some bus drivers, I've seen them at the bus terminal that will take people's scooters apart and put them up in front of the bus, people that can walk a bit, and then transfer and access the bus. There's some that will do that.
Now, Keith, you were saying previously that they're looking at consultation for changes. Is that correct?
Big part consultation for
changes to transport for accessibility.
Yes, the Department of Transport have been working with a number of different groups and looking at putting different vehicles on the road to assist with disabled transportation. Where that stands right now, I don't know, but I know they were working on it. Like I said, there's this last summer, they've put, I think, maybe 20 minibuses on the road with accessible ramps. So it's just a matter of coordinating them and finding out what service structure is going to take place.
Okay, so if someone wanted to kind of be involved in that conversation, would you say they should reach out to the Department of Transport?
They can, yes.
Do their best to advocate?
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but things are slow, but it is happening soon. Hopefully,
Well,
we can
I'll be following up with the Department of Transport, and because I'll try and find out where that's at.
All right. So if Chris finds out where that's at, if anybody is interested in hearing that information, they can send me an email at windreach.bm, and we'll do our best to get that information out. Moving on to kind of transport, but not really, looking at accessible parking. So I know there are accessible parking kind of scattered around Bermuda, but how could we make these spaces better? And I know there's lots of complaints about enforcement. So is enforcement happening, and what does that look like at the moment? So I'll pass that over.
Hamilton. Go ahead.
Keith, go ahead.
Corporation Hamilton just increased the number of disabled parking bays to, I believe it's about 87. And I had a little bit of input in that, where we looked at the International Building Code and worked out the number of parking spaces there are in the total of Hamilton.
Yes.
Don't ask me how many, I can't remember how many thousand it is, but they gave us the number of parking spaces around Hamilton. We looked at the International Building Code to work out how many disabled spaces there should be in relation to the number of bays around the city. So the slope, I think to be up to code, they probably need to include about 5 more spaces. The problem is people having respect for the use of disabled parking bays. I've been to places and people just would not move their car. They sit on them. There's no parking, wouldn't run.
So I think it might be, a concerted effort from everyone, those who, identify as having a disability and those who are just, advocates for those with a disability, that if you see someone who shouldn't be in that spot, politely suggesting otherwise.
Corporation of Hamilton, I can't over this, but Corporation of Hamilton has, the last check I had was about 1,200 disabled parking permits. So.
Okay. So yeah, so normally if someone is parking in those spots, they should have a permit and access to a permit.
Yes.
Correct? Yeah. Chris, did you have a comment?
No, I think just from my own personal experience, it's a case of, getting up a disabled permit is for a long term. And I think that, there's certain things that happen in people's lives where it's a transitory sort of thing. Somebody has, they have the opportunity to get better or whatever. And I've, from my own personal experience, I mean, I know, I've had issues with, in my own household, trying to get somebody to a spot where you can actually just park even just temporarily, and just to get them there, you use a disabled spot. You feel legitimate in using it because you actually do have a disabled person in the car, but you don't have a disabled permit. And I think that, in terms of a community and a community spirit, there needs to be an understanding of how those sort of things work out as well. And I'm really disappointed to hear that there's people who sit in these spaces and won't move when somebody does come who needs it. It's just bizarre to me.
I did have a question in the chat, and I think I'll pose this mostly to Keith. You might have the best idea. What is the consequences of someone parking illegally in a accessible spot? There are parking wardens, but what is that consequence?
I believe given a ticket by one of the traffic wardens, it's still a $75 fine like anyone else parking without a parking meter or whatever. And I knew at one point corporation was working towards trying to increase that to double that fee if you parked in a disabled van and didn't have a badge. Where that stands, I don't know.
And I know someone also has asked, when it comes to the temporary permits, Chris, you were saying that it's mostly for permanent disabilities that those permits are available, not for temporary.
Yes, that's my understanding. And if somebody's broken their leg, they're going to get better. But you still got to drop them off somewhere, or you've got to get somewhere. And I don't know if there's an opportunity to actually just have a temporary kind of solution, or, you know, even with a doctor's certificate or something, just so there's some understanding of how people actually do need to live their lives.
The problem is corporation doesn't have the staff to really monitor the disabled parking badges that they give out. A lady can go to corporation with a letter from her doctor. She's pregnant and she can get a disabled parking badge. The only problem is a lot of people will keep those badges and they would not turn them back in. So after they finish with them, they continue to park in parking bays. But like he said, someone breaks their leg, they got one that's supposed to be a temporary permit. I've known people keep them for 2 and 3 years and don't need them.
Mm-hmm. So it's really a respect for the spot.
Yes,
get back to again. And then Daniella Jade looks like she's coming back on, but she did say into the chat that people need to be mindful also of dropped curves. So they shouldn't be parking in front of areas that kind of have the dropped curve, because that's going to allow individuals with mobility issues who are using wheelchair, walker, etc., to get on and off sidewalks. So not necessarily the spots themselves, but being mindful of those dropped curves and not parking in front of them. Usually there's lines to say you shouldn't anyway, but being mindful for that reason. Daniella, Jade, if you wanted to add to that, but I've just sort of put your comment out there. Your mic is muted, Daniella.
Yes, I agree. Yes, thank you for that, Alyssa. Yes, I feel that people need to be mindful. I was going to say people need to be mindful of drop curbs and parking in front of, on top of sidewalks and drop curbs, and just making sure that they're mindful of wheelchair users and for seniors as well, and the blind as well.
People park motorbikes on sidewalks they're having a problem with, all around Hamilton, so that's a big problem also. Yeah,
bikes on sidewalks, I'm always thinking about how is someone with a walker or wheelchair going to get around that. So definitely key. Thank you.
Can I just say, Lisa, that this is a kind of, it's not just a Bermuda problem, it's a kind of problem worldwide. And as we put more pressure on the infrastructure, you know, I mean, you know, we can all put our hands up and say at one time or another, we've all been tempted to do it when we've been busy or rushed, or, you know, kind of the temptation is always there. One thing I found has been really useful is the education of people, and the best way to start with that is actually educating children in schools, and discussing these kind of issues with them, because you know, back home I was corrected by my own children who were 8 and 9 at the time that you know, Dad, you shouldn't be parking there, or, you know, we were told at school you shouldn't do that, which was kind of great for me, you know, kind of, it gave me the impetus to go, yeah, actually, you know, kind of, I'm just being lazy, or I didn't think of it, you know. So educating kids in schools is a great way to do that.
Definitely. A lot of social change can happen through, you know, talkative children that likes to tell their parents exactly what they should or shouldn't do, for sure. Just briefly, I was hoping Daniella Jade, you could comment on this, and then Vince, in a completely different vein. We know right now we're on a virtual conference, having had to move towards digital interactions like telehealth, online shopping. Has that helped or hindered access for those with disabilities? Daniella Jade, I'll pass that to you.
Okay, with things moving virtually, I feel, as a wheelchair user, I feel that shopping has become become easier in a way, because we don't have to worry about waiting in long lines or constantly checking to see if a place is wheelchair accessible, because we can order things online and get it delivered to your doorstep. But then there's also, with this COVID-19 pandemic, there has been the issue of the delivery slots being taken up. So you have to get a family member to go down and do a grocery shop for you or with you, and making sure that you take extra precautions of being masked up. And so it has, going virtual had its pros and cons. Going virtually, you don't really have to focus too much on wheelchair accessibility, but then have things delivered to your doorstep. But then on the other hand, if you cannot book grocery shopping online, or if you can't book something online, you have to get someone to physically do it for you, especially if the place isn't wheelchair accessible.
Yeah, so that, often if you have some sort of disability, you might be, in that vulnerable person category to begin with. So if we're speaking specifically with the pandemic, you may be asked, or you're isolating yourself for safety. And if those online resources aren't working for you, it becomes quite difficult. Vince, do you have any more comments on that?
Yeah, we're kind of, as a society, we're, worldwide, we're in the middle of a digital revolution where we're transitioning to a digital society for most things. So today, really, if you really want to participate in anything, you need to be able to kind of get involved in that. The big barriers for that are affordability for a lot of people with disabilities. At the moment, it's simply not affordable to kind of do that, and that puts them more and more behind the rest of mainstream society. And I think the responsibility with that lies with government. There has to be a government strategy to make it accessible to everybody in terms of affordability and equipment, and also training for it as well. I think that the COVID pandemic has just highlighted that for everyone. Certainly with Vision Bermuda, we had people that simply because they couldn't order online, or they couldn't access medicines, they couldn't access food, they couldn't access support if they needed it. And my fear is that unless we kind of positively promote this, that people are going to get left further and further behind, when actually, the world should be getting a lot easier and a lot better. I mean, my cell phone now has more computing power than NASA had when they put a man on the moon. And we need to make that accessible to everyone.
Mm-hmm. I just had a comment from Ms. Anne Lindroth, who is a Bermuda Paralympic Association high up in there. She just mentioned a positive in that they were able to have far more people, a wider variety of people at their AGM because it was virtual, because people were sheltering or not able to come out. So there definitely, as Daniella mentioned, and there is positives, but there's definitely some negatives there as well. Chris, you were going to have a comment?
I think also just making it very intuitive to be able to use, and being user-friendly is a really important part. I've found, with my wife who's been ill and unable to sort of having to learn actually how to use a computer mouse again, and through that phase of actually getting to that point to being able to do that, being very, very significantly challenged in her own life. And, just finding ways that it's making it, the technology that is available, very intuitive to use. And I think that's where these designers, these app designers and everything else comes into play, is to make sure, and I think that must be a booming kind of business at the moment, is to actually make sure that it is easy to use and it's intuitive to use.
Definitely. And I know, especially as we saw with Phyllis, apps and websites and things do need to be, laid out intuitively for things that read the text on the screen. So if your website or whatever digital interaction that you have created, if it's not kind of intuitive for those, the programs that are out there, it might be very confusing and difficult to navigate for someone who's using an augmented communication in some way. We're going to move on because we've got 10 minutes left to talk to you guys. So we're going to move on to some discussion about solutions. So we've talked about accessibility when it comes to transport, to the online world, to buildings and permits and things like that. So if we think about our major issues, what do you think some of the solutions might be to those problems, either big or small solutions? We can dream big, can't we? So if anyone wants to have the floor on that one to just start.
I think it's great to just have a good communicative flow of ideas and things. I mean, I'm really intrigued to hear about the difficulty in getting, the ability to just drivers to offer a service. And, I think that if there was understanding as to, proper understanding of how that sort of system was operating at the moment and the real difficulties, and there was enough impetus behind that to actually make it work, getting a livery license for people to actually offer that kind of service is something that I think is achievable, and I think something that we should perhaps investigate further. I think if you don't know about these things and you don't know about the challenges, there's very little you can do to help. So at the end of the day, I think it's really important that people just talk to each other and understand who they need to talk to at various points to actually try and make something happen. And perhaps that's the communication, is really joining the dots in the right way. It's a lot of organizations out there all doing different things, and getting a cohesive response, I think is really vital.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely, Chris. I think the problem is often quite complex. And so it kind of requires kind of central planning for somebody to have an overview of the big picture of all these things, and the ability and the teeth to kind of pull that together, because we all get focused in our own area, and it's quite easy to get kind of bogged down with the difficulties of one group without thinking about another group. And something like a 10-year strategy. Saying this is where we are now and this is where we want to be in 10 years time, and how are we going to get there, that includes everybody, but it's perhaps managed by central government, and they've got the resources and the overview to make it happen.
Yeah, there is so much legislation in place that actually supports all of this stuff already, and oftentimes it's not knowing where that is and people not understanding where to go and find that. And then being able to pull that together. And I think we're all working in our own little bubble to some degree. And, for example, I got involved with the changes to the policy to aged care housing. That was a real eye-opener for me, because there was a whole bunch of stuff that came out of that, and legislative sort of that was pertaining specifically to aged care, which I wasn't aware of prior to that. And when you start getting into this and you discover the various layers to this and how much there actually is already, there's a lot to build on. And joining those dots, I think is the key to making it happen.
Yeah. Keith, do you have any comments?
I do, like Chris said, is about really, I think, just getting the right people to the table, start working inside of this. But if I may just go somewhere else, I see people coming up on the screen. There's a Miss Minus talking about universal design. Just yesterday, the IBA and Aging and Disability Services hosted a universal design seminar, universal design accessible design seminar, and we do training like this all the time for new updates, new building code updates, with the ADA, the American National Standard Institute, and I believe it was attended. It was online. It was attended by about 26 or 27 people. I do know that some of the government offices couldn't access, because I think it might be firewall blocks or whatever. But yeah, we actually had the director of the RLMH Universal Design Institute in Bermuda a few years ago. He was here twice actually, and we've had 2 and 3 days of seminars on universal design and versus accessible design or different things like that. So we're always upgrading and keeping in touch with best practices around the world when it comes to design technology.
So if someone wanted to, if they missed that and are like, oh, that was a great thing that I should have heard about, what department or where should they be training their eye as far as getting resources and information when it comes to accessibility that's coming through the government or other organizations on island?
They can contact myself at Aging and Disability Services, or they can contact the Institute of Bermuda Architects. I believe Vanessa Daniels, she is their education officer. She can give you lots of information.
That presentation from yesterday is available online, and it can be viewed. So there is a link to actually just view it, and it is a good presentation. And I think that, you know, focusing on, in that case, it was accessible bathrooms. It's a very focused discussion, but having multiples of those over different things is wonderful. And the IBA does do a good job in terms of pulling those things together.
Now, I wanted to maybe go ahead, Keith, sorry.
Vanessa's online now, posting her email address. So if anybody needs it, yeah.
So she's putting her email address into the chat. So if anyone, I think she's sent it to panelists. So I'm hoping Tina can maybe put that out to all of the attendees. So I was going to actually throw this to Daniella, Jade. Wanted to highlight if we have any thoughts on organizations or areas in Bermuda that are doing well when it comes to accessibility.
Yes, there are. According to my research, there are. Apparently, the Bermuda Tourism Authority has adopted a UK business initiative, a British business initiative called Purple Tuesday. And some of the businesses that have decided to join this initiative include Ambience Bermuda, Benedict Associates, Bermuda Connections, City of Hamilton, Dolphin Quest, Grotto Bay Beach Resort, Hamilton Princess Hotel and Beach Club, Lifestyles Company Limited, Utopia Eatery, and the Department of Workforce Development.
Excellent. It's always good to, you know, shout out people who are trying to move forward when it comes to accessibility. We have maybe 1 or 2 minutes left until we have to transition. If anyone has any final thoughts, I might start with Chris. I saw you kind of eyes open there.
No, I'm good. I think I just thank you for this opportunity. And, you know, I think for me, it's always trying to identify and find out, you know, who's the right people to go to for various things, and, you know, broadening our own networks of contacts. And this format is a brilliant opportunity to do that. So I think that, you know, really just maintaining that communication after this is really important, and I hope that we can do that.
Would any of the panelists be willing to have their emails put into the chat for attendees to access, so they can access you for more information? So Vince is happy with that. Yes. You don't have to be.
Yeah.
And Chris, it sounded like you were happy with that.
I'm happy. I'm just having trouble accessing the chat function, but please put my email address in there. No problem.
Okay. Keith, I know is your email working?
My email is keithsimmons@ibl.bm.
Nice.
And if Vanessa is fine and she's able to plug it in, maybe you can do it for me, Vanessa. Thank you.
All right. Vince, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah. Especially with the COVID crisis, you know, kind of lots of communities, Bermuda in particular, is under a huge amount of pressure in terms of employment and health and all those kind of things. And in those circumstances, it's understandable that things slip down the agenda. And I would say to government, you know, keep your eye on the ball and just make sure that the needs of disabled people aren't left behind when. Although, you know, it's perfectly understandable, it's a huge problem for the entire world, but just keep your eye on the ball and make sure that people don't slip further behind.
No, thank you. I think it's also important to remember that our demographic is actually changing quite significantly. You know, as an aging population, I think the issues we've been discussing today are going to become more and more acute to a lot more people who haven't had to deal with this prior, simply because they'll be dealing with aging parents or somebody else who will fall into these need these sort of services and need this sort of backup. And we're already seeing that in terms of applications to sort of adjust homes, individual homes, to actually become ADA compliant and more accessible for aged family members to continue living at home rather than being put into homes elsewhere, perhaps because of the COVID you know, and fears over what's happening with COVID, but also because of cost implications as people go, you know, as things move forward. So we certainly face a lot of challenges, and from that perspective, I think that's a significant one.
All right, we are out of time. Oh no. So I'm going to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much. If you have any final thoughts that we didn't get to, you're welcome to throw that into the chat to panelists and attendees. I'm going to let everyone know our code word for this hour to get your CEU credit. It's YOYO. That's YOYO. Our newest addition, our newest goat here at Windreach. So you can send YOYO to windreach@windreach.bm with your name and your profession by the end of the day, and you can get your continuing education credit for this hour. I'm also going to thank Everest Re for, again, allowing us to have this today. They generously sponsored this event for us, and we couldn't have done it without them, so I'm going to thank them. And I'm going to thank, again, you, all of our panelists. Thank you so much for your insight, your experience. And you're welcome to continue on and watch the rest of the conference.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Sophie.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for the invite.
No problem.
Thank
All right, so
you.
thank you guys.